It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce you to Alexis. This is quite funny, wasn't it? We weren't quite sure whether you were he or she. It wasn't that, it was the way it was written. But the programme tonight is about Christina, and it's not Brown, it's Broom, and how she was the pioneering press photographer in the last couple of contracts. All right, okay?
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much for having me in this beautiful venue, actually. I've never been here before, it's great. So this is kind of an interesting one for me. As you'll see, Christina Broom has a little bit of relationship with Fulham Palace, which is where I am community archaeologist. We had written a little bit about her, I think, for International Women's Day, at which point you lot contacted us and said, will you give us a talk on her? So actually the person who'd written the piece was our marketing officer, and she immediately said, yeah, Alexis will do it. So here I am. I'm sure there's probably people that know an awful lot more about Christina Broom than me, but she's certainly a really interesting character, so it was a lot of fun putting this lecture together. It's great to see you guys have put this, these sort of photographs of hers on the side just over there. So I am going to try now to give you the lecture on Christina Broom to the best of my ability from the perspective of an archaeologist at Fulham Palace. So here we go. So originally, her maiden name is Livingston, and she was born on the 28th of December 1862 at 8 Kings Road in Chelsea to Alexander Livingston, who was a bootmaker, and his wife, Margaret Fair. So she's baptised on the 8th of March, 1863, at the Belgrave Presbyterian Church on West Halkin Street in Belgravia. Now, the building is still there, and it's a really nice-looking church, but it's not a church anymore, and is now a private dining restaurant and residence. So very Chelsea / Belgravia, as you can imagine in these days. But yeah, originally very much so a kind of a West London girl, shall we say. She's got a really interesting family background. So her father, Alexander, actually moved to London in the 1840s, and he was originally working as a goldsmith. But he met Christina's mother, Margaret Fair, and she was running one of her father's boot and shoe shops in Sloane Square. So her mum's part of this family business of boot and shoemaking. So Alexander sort of proposes to her, but she basically says to him she won't marry him unless he gives up his business as a goldsmith to let her continue in hers. So she's saying, I'm not going to give up my work, I want to carry on what I'm doing, and if you want to marry me, then you're going to have to give up what you're doing. And funnily enough, he did. And he became a boot and shoemaker as well. So she was obviously from quite a line of fairly strong women, I would say, Christina Broom. And this is a photo here of Mr. Livingston and his friend, Mr. Jackson, I believe, in Margate, about 1860. I'm not sure which one's Mr. Livingston, but he's one of the two there. So one of those is indeed Christina's dad. And you'll see there's this constant link with kind of Margate and like the North Kent coast with the Livingston family. So as a young girl, she's sent in 1871 she is at a ladies' boarding school. So despite not being far from her parents, they send her to a boarding school at 69 Oakley Street in Chelsea. She's aged 8 in 1871, and her older sister Catherine's there as well. So they're educating their daughters, they're sending them to boarding school. And interestingly enough, number 93 would later become home to the suffragettes in 1911, who refused to fill in the census with the no vote, no census thing. And we'll see as we go through the lecture, I've heard you've had one before as well about Christina Broom and her relationship with the suffragettes. So it's kind of interesting to know that she lived on the same street as where they'd established their headquarters. So after her time in Oakley Street, she's sent to Miss Sell's Claremont Academy, which was a school for young ladies in Margate, a girls' boarding school. And I don't know much about it. I did try looking it up, but this is about the best image I could get of it. So this is the boarding school that she went to, down by the coast. And we'll see throughout life again, that Margate link keeps coming up. So we think she probably left that school in about 1879 at the age of 16. So at 16, she would have left Claremont and gone back home. So the 1881 census shows her at home, back home again in Chelsea at 146 Oakley Street, as we can see in the bottom just there. We know from this that her father was born in Edinburgh, her mum was from Twickenham, but her father had passed away in 1875. So by 1881, her father has actually died. So we can see that from this census here, I think, which one down is it? He's the second one down, I think, Robert, her brother. He's now a shoemaker, so he's carrying on in that family business. And they've got a servant, so again, that sort of middle-class family. But on the 30th of April, 1884, so just a few years after this census, her mother died as well at the Oakley Street address, but she left a considerable sum of money. She left £13,664, 19 shillings and 9pence, which in 1884 is a pretty chunky amount of cash, to be quite honest. So it was looking all right for Christina, to be fair, with inheritance. She probably wasn't going to have to work too much, and it was looking like things would be quite good. But unfortunately, her brother was somewhat wasteful. So they inherited the Oakley Street address. They got a share of the rents and the profits from a shop that was presumably one of the boot and shoe shops. But her brother Robert, the shoemaker, was a bit of a gambler, and he squandered a lot of that inheritance in Monte Carlo. So off he went with the family cash and lost it, as it were. So here's a photo or a picture of Monte Carlo. I'm sure he had a great time losing all that money, but wasn't too good for the rest of the family, to be quite honest. But she does have some interesting things going on in her life. So she's decided then she will take on the boot shop, which she did at 290 Kings Road. And in 1884, she went to live above the premises of the boot shop. And she rented out the Oakley Street address to Oscar Wilde, no less, who rented it for his mum. And she lived there for quite a few years, I think about 8 years. And actually, Christina got on pretty well with Oscar and appeared for him as a character witness during his trial in 1895, which didn't go too well for him. But yes, she was Oscar Wilde's landlady, which is quite an interesting fact in itself. And they did appear to get on quite well. But life goes on, as it were, and Christina ended up marrying a man named Albert Broom. So this is where her name changes, obviously. So she marries him in August 1889 at St Saviour's Church in Chelsea. They're both pretty sporty characters. They're both really quite physical in what they do. Albert's really big into cricket. He's a cricket player. Christina really likes swimming, shooting and fishing. So they're quite sporty types. And it's interesting to see here on the marriage certificate that Christina's address is actually recorded at the 8 Kings Road address. So clearly the family, or the Livingstons, had a number of properties, not just the Oakley Street address, but also this one on Kings Road, as well as the shop. And her brother Robert was at the Kings Road address when their mother passed away. So it's interesting to see she's in the Kings Road address rather than the above the boot and shoe shop at this point. Oops, sorry. So very much so West London based again. In 1891, now married, Christina and Albert are living at 4 Napier Avenue in Fulham, and they have their daughter Winifred, who's born on the 7th of August 1890. So at the time, they've got a nurse as well, and a servant, so obviously a fairly financially secure family, with Albert working as an ironmonger. And we can see in a picture here again, Christina on the left, Albert, sorry, bit of a mistake there. I think I used a template which was about Alfred the Great. I think that's why I've got myself confused here. But anyway, Albert, Winifred at the back on the donkey, and Margaret Dunkley, we think, is Christina's sister on the right-hand side. But again, this is another photo in Margate. So Christina seems to keep coming back to Margate. She seems to really like that part of Kent. But unfortunately, despite things seemingly going all right, a disaster struck. So here's a later photo of Albert, Winifred, and we think Albert's mother, Jane. But Albert got injured playing cricket. I forget which year, 1890, in the 1890s essentially. But he was captain of Battersea Cricket Club, so it was a big deal to him. But he was hit in the shin by a cricket ball, and the bone never healed from that injury, which left him in absolutely crippling pain for the rest of his life, and obviously prevented him from doing his job as an ironmonger. So the family is starting to get into a bit of trouble here. The main breadwinner is now sort of disabled essentially and can't carry on with his work. So they decided to move actually down to Broadstairs in Kent, and this is the house they moved to in Osborne Road. And you can see in the census there that they're living there. And I think from that you can see that it says that Albert's actually retired, which is he's only 37, so that's quite a serious issue. So they've moved down to Kent. Albert's obviously really injured. He's retired, and I think they were thinking maybe the air might help him to be out of London. But obviously, they start to suffer from financial pressures now, with no longer having that steady income from the ironmonger works. So it's actually Christina's brother-in-law, Alexander. He suggests to them that they should open a stationery shop, because he's got one in Hampstead. So he thinks stationery is the way to go. Everyone's buying stationery, open a stationery shop. So they established the premises at 87 Streatham Hill, which is, I'm sure all of you are aware, is now Balfour Spikes. But there it is on Google Maps. But the shop, sadly, wasn't a success. But what Christina did notice while she was running the shop was that postcards were really popular. So she's selling a lot of postcards, and she starts to think, this might actually be a means of making some money. So she starts in the first steps of photography at this point. So she decides, well, these postcards seem to be pretty popular, so what if I started taking photographs and selling postcards? So she decides to start a photography and postcard business to cash in on the growing popularity of these things. So she's 40 years old at this point. She's got no experience whatsoever. So this is quite a bold decision, to be quite honest, to suddenly decide that you're going to be a photographer and you're going to make postcards if you've never done it before. And I think now we think of photography as being like super simple, you just get your phone out and take a snap. Back then things were somewhat more complicated. But anyway, she adopts the name Mrs. Albert Broom as her professional name, and she entitles her first set of images as Mrs. Albert Broom's Interesting Snapshot Postcards. So everything very snappy and catchy back then. But she begins, quite early on, she sort of takes a focus and she thinks, well, what am I going to do? So she focuses very much on sort of London street views and events like horse racing, and actually she gets kind of lucky because she turns up at the Epsom Derby in 1903 and she gets a photograph of the winning horse, which I think is it Sand Rock or Rock Sand, with the jockey and the owner. And horse racing's huge at the time. So this is a really big deal that she's managed to get this photograph and put it on postcards. So she's off to a bit of a winner already. And there's her first sales list, which you can see over there as well. So she sort of starts to advertise herself, and she starts to sort of bundle up her postcards and sell them. And what's really interesting when we look at her first sort of sales list is she has underneath the top bit under royal patronage, which is kind of really interesting too. So at the time, you'll see as well still, she might have started taking her snapshots, but they are still in Streatham, very much so when she first established her business. And she's just you can see she's just from the early photos, she's just starting to get to grips with that camera. The photos aren't amazing, but she's getting some interesting shots. So this was kind of a fun one. This is a lady called Mademoiselle Florence, who was actually from New Jersey. But she walked all the way from Westminster to Brighton on that Globe Ball in 1 week, in June 1903. So all the weird and wonderful things that they're doing in the early 20th century. And Christina seems to be quite good at capturing some of these moments and getting photographs of these weird and wonderful things that are happening. And creating the postcards, which are obviously really popular. And as for this royal patronage that she puts on her sales list, well, we're not really sure how she got this or when she got it, but she certainly seems to have somehow managed to ingratiate herself to the point where she can get some quite significant photographs. So it might have been due to the fact she's seen as quite discreet, she's seen as trustworthy, she's not like a huge imposing character, and she seems to be able to build a kind of, or foster a kind of mutual respect with the people that she's photographing. And she becomes a photographer to the lifeguards in the army, and she manages to get quite early on this photograph of Edward VII as well, and President Loubert of France. So she's getting herself going really, and she's getting some quite significant photographs. And this isn't easy. It's not easy work. I mean, Christina was not a big woman. She's quite slight of stature. And she's doing something quite different to what a lot of other people are doing at the time. She's not doing portraiture. She's not using the camera in the way that we'd use it, or people were initially using it just as a new means of taking a portrait or painting somebody. She's using it in a new way and a different way. And it's almost like a sort of documentary making, or like photojournalism, as we'd call it now. She's not just snapping in a studio, she's out on the street. And that's outside work. And this kit, as you can see there in the photograph of it, it's really heavy stuff. It's unwieldy as well, and she had to travel across London with it, get to awkward vantage points to get the photographs that she wanted. So this isn't an easy job, and she's working really hard to achieve the photographs that she's getting. And it is really physical, which is really quite interesting when you compare it to sort of other things that were happening. So the other great assistant, of course, that she had in her business was Winifred, her daughter, who we saw on the donkey earlier in Margate. And she turns out to be like a real support. So Winifred leaves school at 14 to help out with the photography business and the postcard business. So she helps to produce those postcards at home, and Albert starts to add the captions. So this really is a family cottage industry. But with all the work, you know, the plates needed sensitizing with chemicals, the negatives needed to be developed as well, which they were doing in their coal cellar. The postcard stock has to be printed. They're doing that at work, at home as well. That's got to be prepared to receive the print. And up at their busiest, the Brooms were actually producing up to 1,000 postcards a day, which just shows you how like busy the business in postcards really was. And it's sort of around at this point that the family decided to move back to Fulham, where they'd been originally. So in 1904, they're still in Streatham, but by 1911, they'd moved to 38 Burnford Avenue in Fulham. And Albert's actually recorded as an accountant. Now, whether that's just as an accountant for the Broom postcard business, we're not really sure, but that's what he is on the census. And as you can see there, I have ringed 38 Burnford Avenue. And this is really close to Fulham Palace. I mean, Fulham Palace is literally like here, so that's pretty good for us. But as you can see, this is the war or the bomb damage map, and the house that they lived in is black. So it's not there anymore. It got completely destroyed in the war. But by 1921, they'd actually moved from Burnford Avenue. They moved to Munster Road, number 92, and that was after Albert had died in 1912. I think he'd been suffering from tuberculosis, and he'd actually been spending a lot of time recuperating again in Kent, in kind of nursing homes and stuff, because he really wasn't very well. So the decision was made to move. And sadly, we can't see the house that they were working from or living in because it's not there anymore, but Munster Avenue is. But sort of one of the points I wanted to make was really the contrast as to what was going on. So there were other female photographers around at the time, but they were very much so based in the sort of portraiture business. So Alice Hughes would be a good example, but she's taking a lot of photos of kind of high society women and their children and their families, and she's doing that in a home, in their homes, at her home, on Gower Street as well, where she's got a studio established. So it's very much inside work, portraiture, as you can see. She's taking photos of Princess Alexandra, Baroness Catherine of Erlanger, and Ruth Benin something or other on the other side. But this is mostly like kind of portraiture, and she's getting a lot of journal work out of this. So this is kind of stuff like Country Life magazine and things like that. So another successful female photographer, but the work she's doing, you'll see, is in stark contrast to what Christina's doing, which is really, really quite different. And we've got other kind of female photographers as well. We've got, I think, Catherine Pragnall and Lally Charles as well. But again, they're really like doing a lot of their work, again, in studios, portraiture, etc. Using photography as a format, as a new form of art, as it were, kind of using the camera instead of posing for a portrait that would be painted, you're getting photographs, which again, as I'm saying, is quite different to what Christina was doing when she's actually out on the street getting snaps. So, as I was saying earlier, sorry, I'll just take a quick drink. The postcard that Christina's really noticing taking off, it's only in 1902 that a postcard is actually authorised. Before that, it's not a thing. But when they are authorised, they're cheaper than sending a letter. So you can see why they would become really popular. And they're almost like the email of their day. You could write a quick postcard to your friend in the morning saying, I'll meet you for dinner, blah, 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 and you'll get a response because the post's that good back then. It's not like now, where you're lucky to get any mail whatsoever. But yeah, it was like a really good means of communication. So postcards are now, they're legit, they're cheap, they're really good, and you can get a nice little picture with it as well. So you start to see these big postcard companies developing. So whereas Christina's very much got this cottage industry, you'll see things like Bamforth and Company on the top there. They're established in 1910. Raphael Tech and Sons on the bottom. They're like big producers, big postcard producers. So she's up against some quite big guns. But what she's managed to do, starting in 1903, is she's got right on top of it like really quickly. So it was definitely a good business decision. And she really is like a documentarian. When you compare her to some other photographers as we were doing earlier, she's not just interested in photographing people, but she's looking at the world around her, and it's really encapsulating sort of what particularly London looks like, in the early 20th century, the end of Victorian London, the rise of Edwardian London, and she's getting these great kind of streetscapes and these images of everyday life. And that's something that people can relate to as well. So, here we can see Ludgate Circus in 1905. It looks quite different now, I actually dug up a site just literally around the corner from there that was the Fleet Prison. And even just that view up to St Paul's now looks completely different. So she's really capturing sort of moments in time, which is really important, actually. And she's getting great landmarks as well. This is a negative. But obviously these are good sellers, she's a businesswoman, she wants to make money, but she's getting some really good photographs. When you compare this sort of shot to her early ones, you can see she's really learnt her kind of art, and it's a really nice and quite a famous image now of Tower Bridge, that one. So yeah, she knows what she's doing, selling postcards to the tourists, etc. And she's got like a really a keen eye as well. So she might not have had any particular formal training in being a photographer, but you can see, this is the Chelsea Barracks, Royal Hospital Chelsea. She's got a really neat eye for stuff there, and you get that lovely kind of vanishing point towards the back there, which I think just looks great. And interestingly, she's using just this second-hand camera that she bought right up until 1911. It's only then that she actually gets herself a new piece of kit. So you can see she obviously had some great skills and got to grips with the camera quite quick and had a really good eye for what she was doing as well. And a lot of stuff about leisure and play as well, which she's sort of capturing what sort of people are interested in. So obviously the university boat race was like a really, really big thing. It is now, but I think back then it was even bigger. And this is the Oxford crew, I think in about 1911. And they beat Cambridge by, was it 2 3/4 lengths or something in this particular one? But it's quite a famous, actually, cinematographer there on the right-hand side taking the photograph as well. Is it Alexander Kocic, I think his name is? But anyway, you can see she's got access right down to the front there right down on the riverside. So she's, by this point, she's really established herself as a press photographer. Well, she is obviously doing postcards. She does sell some of her photographs to the press, but she's obviously got that respect now that she is clearly an accepted sort of individual who is now enabled to get really close to the action to take photographs. And she's got this sort of lasting legacy with the boat race as well. I mean, this is right, this is shortly, a couple of years before she died. But here she is. I mean, the whole of the Cambridge crew photographed with her. They obviously knew exactly who she was. And there's some really interesting people in here as well, which includes like Ran Laurie, is Hugh Laurie's dad. You can see standing next to her just on her left-hand side on the right, as well as some other interesting characters. So we've got, I think, Desmond Glover, I think he's Kingsman or something, he's killed in World War II. And then another guy, David Rayford, is it Burnford or something like that? He was a doctor anyway, but he committed suicide in 1994 after, I think, 1984. It was a ridiculous, something like 34 pounds of cocaine were found in his car in Colorado. So some interesting characters in that Cambridge boat team anyway. But it's really interesting just to see that Christina kept the relationship going with the boat race to the extent that the teams are getting themselves, she's getting photographed with the teams like every year because she's very much so almost a part of the boat race in itself. And she's getting some really nice, just sort of local photographs as well that are really sort of time capsulate. So Kensington Gardens in 1905, which is really nice. It's just the kind of being able to see the dress and what people were looking like back then. And I think that the boy back there's got a boat on the pond and stuff like that. So she's sort of getting some great shots in general that, again, going to sell some good postcards. But then we get onto kind of her relationship with the suffragettes, essentially. So she covered the suffragette movement from 1908 to 1913, right from the off, to be quite honest, really early on. So this was the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, and that's their Hyde Park, their first kind of big gathering on Women's Sunday on, I think, the 21st of June 1908. So she's in there from like the beginning, photographing the suffragettes. And it's a really interesting kind of social movement to look at, and the fact that she's managing to capture this. And like one of the main reasons is obviously she can see she can make money out of this. I mean, that's what she's doing. She's selling postcards and selling photos to the press. So at the time, the suffragettes are this like really colourful and intriguing group of people, especially with their sort of flamboyant hats and what they're dressed in. We don't know if Christina was like a devout supporter of the movement, or she just sees this as a business opportunity, and that photographing suffragettes is going to make money. You are going to sell postcards. So a lot of support for the suffragettes, therefore people will buy the postcards. And they're almost like, to begin with, they're almost like pop stars of the day. They're like these people, these women are quite famous. And if you're selling postcards, this is Christabel Pankhurst, the daughter of Emmeline, and a co-founder of the WSPU. If you're selling photographs or postcards of the suffragettes, you will make money out of it because they're particularly with their supporters, they're really, really popular and incredibly photogenic as well. And this is actually her local WSPU branch, the Putney and Fulham one, which is on Fulham Road, I think. It's now a Fulham brass shop, I think. But that was the local branch, very close to Fulham Palace again. But things get kind of interesting a bit later on. I've noted there that obviously Fulham Palace is the home of the Bishop of London. And a bomb, in fact, was discovered in St Paul's in 1914. Was quite a concern for the Bishop of London himself, Arthur Winnington Ingram. So his relationship with the suffragette movement is quite interesting, as we'll see in a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that's her photographing the WSPU, local WSPU branch, as it were. And she's getting photographs again. She's able to get herself right to the front of what's going on here. And she manages to get a photograph of Emily Wilding Davison. There aren't a lot of photographs of her, so she's done really well to get this, which makes this quite an important photograph. Emily's the one with the mortarboard on. She's also got Emmeline Pankhurst there, Pethick Lawrence, and I think Sylvia Pankhurst and Emily Wilding Davison. So Emily Davison famously died after running in front of the King's Horse in the Epsom Derby on the 4th of June 1913. But as I said, there aren't a lot of photographs of her, so this was a significant photo. But as you can see from that, the suffragettes are starting to get quite militant by this point, which makes things a little bit more interesting. So she stops photographing them. In 1913, she stops photographing the suffragettes. And we're not really sure why. Obviously, that movement continued until the outbreak of World War I. But she stops. In the summer of 1913, she's no longer photographing suffragettes. And that might have been due to the fact that they are becoming quite militant by this point. And there is a reaction to that. And it might be the fact that they're no longer profitable. So the postcards aren't selling as well. There's a kickback against it. So she stops photographing the movement. And of course, one of the major things she's got is that royal patronage, which, as we'll see, is really important to her, certainly getting access to certain places. So by following that movement, she might be starting to threaten her own livelihood and her access to elements of her job that she needs to retain. This is an interesting one. So, it's interesting for me. This is actually the church I went to as a child. But this is St Catherine's in New Cross, and that burnt down, supposedly, or was believed to have been set on fire by the suffragettes on the May the 6th, 1913. So, interestingly, that was actually on the day that a women's suffrage bill was defeated in the House of Commons. So it does seem slightly coincidental that it caught fire. And the clergy were very much seen as hostile to the cause, as it were. So churches were targeted, and it's just interesting to see that St Catherine's was burnt down on that date. And again, as I was saying earlier, May 1913, so literally I think the day after the St Catherine's fire, a bomb's found near this throne, or the bishop's throne, in St Paul's Cathedral. Wrapped in brown paper and with a recent issue of the Suffragette as well. So it's pretty obvious who'd left it there, I think. The bomb actually failed to go off, and it was believed to have been timed to detonate at midnight. So it didn't go off, and it was found the next morning. But a bit of a shock for the Bishop of London, that's for sure. And again, you can see from this sort of stuff how the suffragettes are becoming quite militant. I mean, it was interesting researching this. I didn't know that they'd actually invented the letter bomb. So yeah, quite interesting to see. And again, that may be a reason why Christina decides that she's going to move on to photographing other things rather than the suffragettes. And there is a sort of a reaction to the violence, as it were. This is a picture of a suffragette bomb put in a mustard tin. So the general public do start to get upset with the violence, and a WSPU meeting in Hyde Park was broken up by an angry mob. The WSPU offices in Bristol were raided and ransacked as well by Bristol University students because the suffragettes had burnt down their sports pavilion. So it may be that, again, she's just not selling enough of those suffragette postcards, and she thinks, she'll make more money out of photographing something else. But she's developed a pretty solid business. She's ingratiated herself to the king, which is really good. She's actually got access to the Royal Mews as well. And twice a week, she used to erect her stall outside or next to the Mews main gate, and she sells her prints there. And there's a nice photograph of Christina with her prints for sale. And as you'll see at the top, she says, "These are all photographs taken by me." So yeah, she's got a good business going. She's working really hard. She's getting some really good photographs and selling lots and lots of postcards. So I guess the question is, and this is how I'm here, what is Fulham Palace's interest in Christina Broom? Well, between the 10th and 16th of June 1909, it was decided to hold a church pageant, the English church pageant, and that was designed to educate the people of the country on the history of the church. And that was held in the Warren, as it was called back then, which was attached to Fulham Palace. It's now if you know the area, it's now the Fulham Palace Meadow Allotments Gardens. So it was handed over as allotments in 1918. But before then, this is kind of big open space. So they decided to have this big pageant there. And they spend lots of money in it. They get the master of the pageant is called Mr. Frank Lascelles. He's done a lot of the Quebec pageants in Canada. And again, as I've said, they're held in the Warren, which is now the Meadow Allotments Association. And she gets some nice snaps, as you'd imagine. So we get it's kind of like a drama, I suppose. Think kind of, I don't know, a sort of religious equivalent of the Royal Tournament or something like that. But we get the procession of the archbishops here. I don't know which archbishop's which, but we're sort of telling the history of the church, as it were, and Christina's on hand to photograph it all. And this is supposed to be a group, or this is a group of people from St. Stephen's Church in Gloucester Road in Kensington. They're apparently costumed as Cistercian nuns. But you can see the big stands that were erected in the background. There's a lot of kind of, sort of like set design going on in the background. So they spent quite a lot of money on it, and it did prove to be quite popular. And to the extent that the next year they decided to do an army pageant. So we've done the church, now let's do the army. So Bishop Winnington Ingram, he's a bit militarist, shall we say, very much so a sort of recruiter for World War I. Probably not looked back on amazingly well for those terms, but he was very much so involved with the military, so he decides this would be a good idea. So they have the army pageant, which runs between the 20th of June and the 2nd of July 1910. And that was designed to encourage a sense of patriotism and showcase the development of the art of war amongst people of the British Empire. Which probably doesn't sit too well today, and particularly considering what was about to happen in 4 years' time, somewhat naive, shall we say. But here we have a bunch of men dressed as Civil War pikemen. But what I quite like about that photograph is you can actually see Fulham Palace in the background. So we don't have loads of photographs of the palace from this period, but it's amazing to see the kind of ivy on it, which is no longer there. But what obviously is quite sad about a lot of these photographs is a lot of the young men in them would obviously go to war in a few years' time, and many of them would not return. And it's also kind of funny to look at the photos and to look at the kind of, the early 20th century, I can say this, I'm an archaeologist, the early 20th century interpretation of history and what people look like. So I think these ladies are supposed to be Vikings, kind of wings on the helmet and stuff like that. And obviously like complete nonsense. But it is significant because, particularly for Fulham, because the Vikings are supposed to, or Viking force is supposed to have overwintered there between AD 878 and 879. But yeah, she's getting these great images of the pageant, what's going on. She's obviously getting back behind the scenes and getting some photographs. And they look great. I think the one on the right-hand side is really quite famous with St. George. And we've got some sort of, I think these are some arquebuses or something like that, Spanish arquebuses just there on the left. But again, as I've said, it's quite sad to think a lot of these young men would not be around for much longer, given what was about to happen. So World War I becomes obviously like a really big thing for Christina. She's got that access, she's got the royal patronage, and she gets in with the British Army, which is really interesting. So she's recorded a bit of royal ceremony, but she really records the military in quite keen detail. I think one of her famous quotes was, "I've photographed all the king's horses and all the king's men, and I am never happier than when I am with my camera among the crack regiments of Britain." So she developed this really good relationship, particularly with the lifeguards, who she's kind of the official photographer for. And you can see those three, that's quite a famous one of her photographs, three of the lifeguards there from 1915. And it really started by, like most sort of things that seem to have happened with Christina's kind of photography career. It was just an accident, again, as to how this happened. So she has a chance encounter with the Scots Guards at Burton Court in 1904, and she's there sort of messing around with her camera, and they invited her in and said, "Will you take some photos?" So she did, sent them to them. They said, "These are great. Will you come back tomorrow?" And she became the kind of photographer for the household division as well. And that relationship with the army endured with Christina and the British Army right up until her death in 1939. So she maintains this relationship, which means she gets some great photos. This is the Regent's Park Barracks, is quite a good one as well, because we can see one of the guys has taken his helmet off, so you can actually see his face, whereas the rest of them are all covered. So I think that's quite a well-known one as well. And in her own sort of abstract way, she becomes an accidental recruiter almost. So Lord Roberts, who VC, he was a big fan, and he noticed that when she took the photographs of them and printed them up, took them to him, the soldiers were buying them.
Stop in a few minutes.
Oh, okay, sure. Okay. He noticed that soldiers were buying them, and then they're sending them home. So it's kind of interesting in the sense that the postcards get home, and the relatives of the soldiers realise that they're well fed, they're well shod, they seem to be happy. And I think he said, I've prayed and begged for recruits, and now the 3rd Scots Guards and the Irish Guards are suddenly flooded with recruits from their homes. So she's almost seen as this kind of accidental recruiter in that she's taking these photos, printing them up, soldiers are buying them because there's pictures of them, sending back to their families, and they're back in sort of Scotland and Ireland. They go, well, life in the British Army doesn't look too bad, and they're signing up. And these kind of photographs are really kind of iconic, really. Do you want me to pause there? Okay, sure. Thank you very much, everyone. It's not that many slides left, you're all right. So moving on from her being a recruiter for the Irish Guards, and you can see the whole slide now as well, which is nice. She is capturing like a really significant point in time. So as you're seeing from a lot of the photographs, it's quite a societal changes are going on with the suffragette movement, etc. But it's interesting that there's that contrast between photographing the suffragettes and then documenting the very conservative and the royalist military, of course, which she's photographing too. But you've got to remember there's a lot of changes going on that front as well. Warfare is going to have to adapt very quickly. We're going to see the horrors of World War One. And as this is all about to prove, old tactics don't work against new technology. And this is an interesting photo of 1915. This is a photo of the Blues and Royals, normally a cavalry regiment, dismounted. And you can see they look really rather uncomfortable without their horses. They don't really look like they know what they're doing, to be honest. So you can see those sort of changes are sort of happening at that time. And she's doing she's photographing the Navy as well. I mean, I found the photographs she's taking of the Navy really interesting. So many of these sailors are just like, they have no shoes on, and you're just kind of like, well, that must be a thing, But she's photographed here HMS Dreadnought, which is obviously the ship that changes, navies globally. And this is all for the review of the fleet for Edward VII and Nicholas II of Russia. So we've got the Dreadnought there just outside Southend, and there's the crew of the Dreadnought as well. And again, she's got a nice photo of all of them together. But a lot of it's quite sad at the same time. So this is a photograph. She's got the first lifeguards here, mobilising at the Knightsbridge Barracks in August 1914, and they're destined for Mons. And literally 6 months later, men in this photo, they're all either dead, maimed, or imprisoned. And it's difficult for Christina as well, because she's been photographing these regiments for a long time, and she actually knows these soldiers, she knows these men. And they're actually, Winifred has actually documented the names on the reverse of the prints, so she knew all of these people. She's got a good relationship with them, comfortable with the relationship, and then she's seeing them all go off, and a lot of them, they're not coming back. And she's also getting the goodbyes as well. So she's taking photographs of troops leaving for the front and saying goodbye to their families, and a lot of the time they didn't come back again. And these are the last photos that their families have got of their husbands, sons, fathers, etc. This one's actually got a positive end to it. And this is First Life Guide Trooper Wannell from Fulham. He's shown leaving from Waterloo in 1915, but he did make it back, survived, and he became caretaker, funnily enough, at Fulham Town Hall. And this one makes me laugh a little bit. This is a photo of Private Harry Barter, who was the tallest man in the British Army at 6'9" and a quarter. for the Grenadier Guards. I did actually look him up. So he had actually signed up in 1911, so he'd been in the army for a while. And the bit that I don't get is he said he was shot in the ankle. I mean, what was he doing? A handstand or something? You know, it's like, how much of him do you want to miss? You know, but he was also injured in the shoulder apparently, so it wasn't just the ankle injury. But he survived the war, and he went back to the family farm in Devon. So he was a farmer's lad. But I found that just the most hilarious anecdote, as it were. And this is obviously the famous snap that you can see over there as well. So she's got the Prince of Wales here in 1914. So obviously it's not like a portrait sitting, but the photographs are really great. He seems like really comfortable with Christina photographing him. Obviously, famously, he's made Edward VIII in 1936 and abdicates due to his relationship with Wallace Simpson. But he seems to be quite comfortable with Christina there. It's a nice photo, and he's not he doesn't find her, clearly he's not finding her imposing or irritating or anything like that, and was quite happy to pose for the photograph. And that relationship, as I said, with the army continues right to the end of Christina's life. So she continues to photograph them right up until her death in 1939. This is the first Scots Guards on Armistice Day in 1930, so she's still photographing them then as well. Sadly, though, Winifred, who was actually a skilled photographer herself, having learnt from her mother and having worked in that industry, she can't really carry on with the business, particularly from a military perspective, in that by the time Christina dies, the newly formed Ministry of Information basically said to her that all backgrounds would have to be deleted. And that just made the whole process for her completely uneconomical. She couldn't do that. And then, the whole business relied on getting the photographs taken and printed really quickly, so you could get them out and sell them, and they're capturing moments of time, but people want them instantly. So sadly, she just couldn't carry on with the business at all. So Christina passed away on the 5th of June, 1939, still at 92 months the road. And she had suffered from quite a lot of pain over the years from all that, lugging all that kit about. At times she was confined to a wheelchair, but she still carried on. And here we can see that photograph again, of Christina on the left, Winifred at the back, and Christina's sister, Margaret, on the right-hand side. And there is Winifred on the left and Christina on the right, so mother and daughter. But Winifred, despite being a good photographer, she couldn't carry on with her mother's business after her death. And despite all that, she remained really devoted to her mother's work. She obviously, she knew that her mum had done a really good job. She knew that her mother's work was significant. And she strived really hard to make sure that the archive was taken by someone. And it took her a long time before finally the Museum of London, or now the London Museum, agreed to take them. Which they did, and just as well they did, because these would have just been lost otherwise. But sadly, again, Winifred passed away on the 22nd of June, 1973. She never married or had children, so that was the end of the Broom line, as it were. There we go, end of lecture. Thank you very much.